on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Today I want to talk to you about a book that I finished reading today, Superman vs. Hollywood. How fiendish producers, devious directors, and warring writers grounded an American icon, by Jake Rosen, or Rosen. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. This is a prose book. I don't want to call it a novel because it's not a narrative. This is a historical document, if you will, about 300 pages long, and it's basically exactly what it says in the title. This starts briefly with Superman's creation in the comics by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and it goes forward mostly focusing on stuff in radio and movies and television, the misadventures of trying to create Superman stories outside of comics. It more or less stays away from the comic book side of things, but it covers just about everything that you have ever heard of with Superman outside of the comics. Now, sometimes it will just quickly skim past something. For example, Superman the Animated Series in the 90s, it doesn't really talk a lot about that. And that's probably because there wasn't a whole lot of behind-the-scenes drama with that show. But then it talks a whole lot about the Christopher Reeve movies. It has a few different chapters on those. In fact, there's an entire chapter for Superman 3, an entire chapter for Superman 4. Supergirl the movie gets an entire chapter. And so this at times delves into stuff quite a bit, and then at times you're thinking, wow, you could have spent at least another chapter on this thing. This book came out in 2008, early 2008. So by the time you get to the mid-2000s, it's starting to get a little bare on details, and that's kind of interesting when you're looking at it in retrospective now, almost over 10 years later, but also it's a little embarrassing at some points because this book ends talking about the movie Superman Returns, and it's saying, well, Bryan Singer says the sequel is going to have more action, and looking back now, oh, that's a little silly. We never got a sequel, and I want to see the follow-up to this. Unfortunately, we've only had 11 years since this book came out. I don't know if there's that much information out there to warrant Jake Rosen doing another sequel or another book covering more behind-the-scenes drama. Now, I really would have loved to have seen his take on Batman vs. Superman, Man of Steel, the rest of Smallville, because he kind of talks reverently about Smallville, which I find to be pretty strange because I don't think that that's a very good show. I don't think that it's a very good representation of Superman, but he kind of considers that to be one of the high points of Superman outside of comics. But I really like this book. For the most part, I think it does a really good job of compiling all of this information. It doesn't really pull any punches. You would expect it to because a lot of this is from secondhand accounts, I guess. It's interviews with people who were there when all this stuff was going on. So he doesn't paint, for example, Hollywood producer Jon Peters, he doesn't paint him as being a very nice person. He kind of calls him, he sees a spade and calls it a spade, if you will. So Jon Peters doesn't come out looking very good in this, but then there are times where you kind of feel like you're on Jon Peters' side after seeing some of the stuff here. But this does a really good job of laying out timeline stuff. Sometimes there's timeline stuff that kind of overlaps and intersects, like Smallville happened from, I think, 2001 to 2010 or 2000 to 2010, something like that. So it lasted a good long while. Right in the middle of that is when Superman Returns came out. So sometimes the book will go forward a little bit, and then in the next chapter it will go back a few more years to cover some stuff that it didn't get around to covering. So this is a really interesting book. I like it quite a bit. There is information here that you will have trouble finding anywhere else. A few months ago, whenever I was doing one of my videos of what I would do if I rewrote Superman 2, I mentioned that somewhere I had read that in the Superman radio show, they came really close to having Superman reveal his secret identity to Lois Lane, and they were going to become partners, and she would know his secret identity moving forward, and the status quo would be permanently bent. And I looked high and low across the internet, could not find where I had originally found that out. I still don't know where I originally heard about that, but just when I was thinking, maybe I imagined that, maybe that wasn't something that actually happened, I read about it in this book. So this is a wealth of information about Superman outside of comics. I really enjoyed this. I think my favorite part, actually, is I don't want to say that I found a new appreciation for the movie Superman Returns, but reading about the 1990s where they were trying to make a Superman movie throughout the entire 90s, and it went through several different aspects, if you will. There was a point where Kevin Smith wrote a script, and then Tim Burton came in to direct, and then he immediately said, I'm not using Kevin Smith's script. There were at least 4 or 5 different scripts for one version of that movie, which was basically Superman Lives, although it was called Superman Reborn, Superman Lives, and then you had a new script come in, which was basically its own thing, Superman Flyby, written by J.J. Abrams, and was going to be directed by Brett Ratner at one point, which I don't think I knew that. I had always heard that Superman Flyby was going to be directed by McG, who did the Charlie's Angels movies, but a lot of stuff here about these movies that never got made, and then some stuff that I wish we had even more information about, like around the time when Superman Flyby was not being made and they were wanting to make it, there was another producer at Warner Brothers, so you had 2 producers, both wanting to make separate Superman movies, and then they basically had to kind of fight it out, and everyone said, okay, we want to make Superman Flyby. This other guy, he wanted to make a Batman vs. Superman movie, and I wanted to know more about that. That sounded kind of interesting in a macabre kind of way, but I enjoyed this book. I think that if you are a fan of Superman on the big screen or the small screen, you will probably like it. I'm thinking if you are like reverential towards, say, the Christopher Reeve, Richard Donner movie, you might not enjoy it as much because it is very candid. It does kind of paint some of these people who were involved with these movies in a bad light. The Salkinds do not come out looking very good in this. Like I said, Jon Peters does not come out looking very good in this. Even some of the other people, like the actors, they kind of come out looking a little petty at different times. For example, I'm a big fan of the first 2 years of the Lois and Clark TV show. I haven't watched much past that, but I have the first 2 seasons on DVD. I really like that show. And then you read this book, and Terry Hatcher and Dean Cain apparently didn't really get along very well, and they were kind of petty with each other. And that doesn't necessarily paint the show in a bad light, but it could potentially do that for you for something you like. So if you're a big fan of the live-action Superboy series from the late 80s, early 90s, you might not want to read this book because it doesn't necessarily make that show look very good, or the live-action Superman movies, or something like that. Now, some of it, like I said, Smallville, it doesn't really do anything to make that show look bad, and I wonder if maybe because this was written while that show was still going on, that maybe Jake Rosen was still too close to it. I don't know. But some of the stuff like Superman Returns and Smallville, it seems like he's still too close to those things, and if he had waited a few years to write this book, maybe he would have been a little bit more critical of those things. I don't know. But overall, I really enjoyed this book. I had a really good time reading it. I actually, when I first bought it, it was maybe last year, I got it on eBay. There was this eBay seller who, it was a buy 2, get 1 free kind of deal, and so I got this mostly just so I could get a free book, and then I really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that I got it. So those are my thoughts on Superman vs. Hollywood. I hope that you guys liked this review, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys later in the week with another video. In the meantime, have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.